Welcome to our third module. In this particular module, we will be discussing how to differentiate instruction in general, but specifically how to differentiate for science, math, and technology. So one of the things that you will notice with regard to differentiation is that differentiation, if you are applying appropriate principles, actually is relevant across subject matter areas. So if you are differentiating appropriately, what you have done is you have looked at all of the students in your class and you have determined their strengths and their needs. You have looked at the students who have, say, an individual education plan or a 504 plan, and you have looked at the services they are receiving. You have looked at the area in which they are qualifying for services. So let's say, for example, they have an other health impairment due to, say, having anxiety or depression, or maybe they have a specific learning disability. This is probably going to be the most common disability that you see in the classroom. So they will have a specific learning disability, say in reading or reading comprehension, mathematics. So that's essentially determined by testing. So there are other areas of disability as well that you may run into. One of the other ones that's very common too is qualifying for services in the form of for autism. Okay, so in those particular instances, what we always need to do is refer to the student's individual education plan and coordinate or collaborate with the education specialist or resource specialist or program specialist at your site or your district, so that way you really understand what the student needs and you know how to go about implementing the appropriate accommodations or modifications for those students in your classroom. Now, one of the things that I want to continue to reinforce throughout the class is that accommodations and modifications listed in an IEP or accommodations listed in a 504 plan, those are not optional. You as a teacher by law are required to ensure that students are receiving those accommodations and modifications in your classroom. So let's go ahead and flip to the PowerPoint. I am going to share my screen. So if you open up Canvas and open up the course, you'll see for Module 3 there is a differentiated instruction lecture. And it says read only. However, you will see that you have this video now to accompany the lecture itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we are exactly differentiating. So last week we talked about differentiating instruction for English language arts, social studies, basically the language-based courses. Now this week we're going to talk a little bit more about how we differentiate for science, math, and technologically based classes. You will notice though that many of the same principles apply. Much of the same strategies will actually work, which is really, really nice. So a lot of times teachers will tell me, I am way too busy. I have way too many kids in my class. It's really difficult to kind of go through my lesson plan and make these changes. The good news is that if you do it once, it will become habit. It will become routine, and then you will naturally start incorporating these processes into your teaching practices. Another nice thing that many students stumble upon is they will look over ways in which you can differentiate your instruction, and they say, oh, I'm already doing that, which is great. The nice thing is that if you are applying the principles of universal design, many of those knock out a number of the differentiation strategies we talk about. So for example, if you are teaching using multiple modalities where you are appealing to multiple senses, that is a wonderful way to accommodate a number of students, because as a result, what we do is that by incorporating more senses, brain research is showing, so research in brain-based teaching indicates that we are much more likely to get information to transfer from short-term memory into long-term memory. So the more senses you incorporate in your lessons as you teach, the better. So rather than just talking at your students where you're primarily using an auditory approach, you would want to use more visuals. So if we're talking about science and math and technology, this can actually be pretty easy, and you may be doing this already. So you may have visual models to represent a concept that you are discussing. In addition to that, you'll want to incorporate some kinesthetics. So maybe you want to have the students perform a hands-on activity in conjunction with the auditory input and the visual input. And as a result, we're using multiple modalities, and we're much more likely to get that information to transfer from short-term to long-term memory as a result. Okay, so if you feel as though you're a little stressed, kind of like this lady in the picture here, keep in mind that when you first start tackling lesson plans and you start to differentiate, yes, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but the nice thing is that once you do it, then future lessons, it becomes a lot easier. It will become kind of second nature to you. So what we want you to do is just kind of look at your lesson plans from the start. So look at your anticipatory set, then look at the input, and then look at the guided and independent practice portions as well as the closure, and ask yourself, okay, based on the students I have in my class, are the instructional modalities that I'm using in these portions of the lesson, are these consistent with their needs? If I have a student in my class that has a visual processing disorder, then maybe you're going to want to incorporate more auditory techniques, maybe some music, maybe some art, if that's something that the student likes. So a lot of differentiation too is figuring out what your students like, figuring out what they enjoy. That actually appeals to the motivation piece as well. So there is a particular motivation theory called interest and affect. When we are interested in the subject and the subject is creating positive feelings within us, we are much more motivated to learn the material. It's much more likely that the new material we are learning is going to transfer into long-term memory because we are interested in it. So even though that's something you may already know, a lot of times teachers will reflect on their practice and say, you know, I could do a little bit more of that. I could start to incorporate my students' interests a little bit more into that lesson. And again, there's another strategy for differentiating instruction. Okay, so much of what I just discussed actually applies to these particular statements here. Kids need to be able to feel safe. They need to be able to feel supported. If your students feel as though you are interested in their learning processes, or what we formally would refer to as, say, learning styles, then they actually will exert more effort. And they tend to be more motivated on average to learn and to complete the assignments that we want them to. So a lot of times I hear teachers say, well, so-and-so just isn't motivated. And that is not the case. We are all motivated, but what we're talking about is they may not be motivated to complete assignments, or they may not be motivated to study for tests. So we have to figure out what motivates our students, and a lot of times that's just what interests them. Okay, so just think about yourself. We are very motivated by the things that interest us. Okay, so in addition to that, you want to again look at IEPs, 504s, look at those test results. And if you are incorporating that information into student strengths and incorporating students' interests as well as their strengths into your instruction, then that's a great way to differentiate instruction. So let's say, for example, you're teaching a science, a math, or technologically based class. Projects offer a lot of leeway in this regard because students are offered choices. If you give them choices in terms of project they complete, they can incorporate their particular strengths into the project. They can bring their strengths to the project, their interest into the project, and as a result, they're going to be much more likely to learn the material and much more likely to produce a product that they are proud of and that you're happy to grade. Okay, assessment I'm not going to go into extensively just because we are going to have an entire module on differentiated assessment and alternative assessment. But I just talked a little bit about a project which serves as an amazing alternative assessment. The nice thing is that with Common Core and 21st century skills, we're seeing a lot of projects anyway, and a lot of you teachers are already using projects as a form of assessment. So it's kind of nice to kind of get away from those pencil and paper based exams that were much more traditional or are more traditional in nature. So that is another way to differentiate your instruction, is by providing an alternative form of assessment where students can express or demonstrate competency in an alternative fashion that's a little less traditional. Okay, so we talked a little bit about who's in this class. Part of differentiation is not just about making sure that the material is designed to meet the students who may struggle with the subject matter, but also those who may be gifted, who may find the material to be rather easy if in its current fashion. So a lot of times teachers make the mistake by saying, okay, well, how, by modifying up, I'm just going to give the student more work. It's like, okay, well, great, you know, Sam has finished this assignment, so now Sam can complete this particular assignment. And then as a result, Sam loses motivation to complete the work that you assign because he or she has now determined that finishing early and doing well is just going to result in an additional assignment. So as a result, you need to look at different opportunities. So again, this is providing, say, alternatives. So rather than completing the traditional assignment, maybe create an opportunity for that student to create a project or a product where they're doing some more extensive research that involves the concepts that he or she has already mastered, but they're going to take it to a higher level and use those higher levels of critical thinking skills that we want them to use. Okay, so we talked also a little bit about different auditory and visual channels. Again, the big thing here is that we want to use a variety of instructional modalities. We also want to encourage positive emotion. So one of my former professors at USC, Dr. Mary Helen Imordino-Yang, has done some amazing research on affect and how affect is involved in learning. Think about the most successful learning experiences you've ever had. Chances are you were experiencing a lot of positive emotion during that time. If you also think about, let's say, for example, the most negative learning experience you've ever had, or your least favorite teacher of all, chances are that person elicited a lot of negative emotion within you. So when we create positive emotional experiences, we increase engagement, we increase motivation, and we also increase the likelihood that students are going to remember and retain and apply the information that we are teaching them. Okay, so these are some suggestions by Chapman and Gregory, a couple of researchers that have done some research on planning and instructional strategies. So these are some of the things that you need to ask yourself when you are planning and as you're creating your lesson plans and, of course, teaching. Ask yourself what kids know or should be able to know or should know by the end of the experience. So this kind of goes back to pedagogy and teaching 101. However, you'd be surprised how many observations I complete of students at a variety of universities where the lesson plan or the lesson objectives are not clearly stated. They are not written on the board. They are not referred to at the beginning and the end of the lesson as we should and throughout the lesson. So make sure you can clearly define and refer to your lesson plan objectives. How will you know they're successful? Assessment should not take place at the end of the lesson alone. Assessment should take place while you are teaching. So you need to be able to check in and monitor all your students. However, additional attention and consideration needs to be given to those that may be struggling in the area or those with special needs, those with language needs. You're going to have to figure out ways throughout the lesson that you can monitor and adjust your teaching, and that's another form of differentiation. You have to figure out what students already know and what they can already do. Because it's nice to just briefly review material. You don't want to spend a lot of time teaching things that students already know. You're going to lose them. They will no longer be motivated, and then again, that's when we start to see some behavior problems when students get bored. Again, differentiation is also very important because many behavior problems result from material being too easy for a student or material being too challenging for a student. So material needs to be delivered and taught at the appropriate instructional level. Ask yourself how you can capture their attention. So a lot of times this may involve some form of technology, involve what students are interested in, what they enjoy, music, art, physical movement and activity. All of these tend to act as some type of a hook. This will create a positive emotional reaction in the students, and this will encourage them to remain engaged, basically. Ask yourself how you are going to help students acquire the new skills that they need or master the information that you are providing. As a result, this is where that assessment process as you're teaching is going to be very, very important, because what you'll have to do is figure out if that particular form of information or skill can be acquired in an alternative way. So let's say, for example, you have a group of students who are not, quote, getting it in the way that you are currently teaching the lesson. What is another way that you could teach the lesson so that that way it appeals more to, say, their learning preferences? Ask yourself if students will practice or rehearse the meaning and understanding of materials and figure out ways or alternative ways that they can demonstrate concept mastery. So let's say, for example, you want students to write 2 paragraphs in an interactive notebook for the biology class you are teaching. You may have a student, though, that has dysgraphia, and that may be so in other words, the act of writing could be very challenging for this particular student. Can you provide an alternative? So rather than, say, writing 2 paragraphs, maybe he or she writes 1. Maybe he or she can draw a picture or a model representing what it is you would like him or her to understand. Okay. And feedback. Feedback is incredibly important. So with regard to feedback, what we have learned from research is that feedback needs to be immediate. It needs to be short, sweet, and specific, okay? We also like to keep it positive, okay? So if students can immediately get input as to what they could do to improve in a particular area, and we provide that information in a concise manner, so using as few words as possible, students are much more likely to take that feedback and apply it in the way that we would want them to. A lot of times I see teachers give great feedback, but they go on and on and on and on, and the students kind of check out because it's too much. Okay, excessive cognitive load. So as a result, not too much becomes accomplished, even though the teacher did a great job of providing information. It was just too much information. Another major mistake with regard to feedback is that a lot of times it is delayed. We wait too long. So try to give feedback as immediately as possible in a concise fashion in order for it to be effective. Okay, so now this is a 6-step planning model for differentiated instruction, which you can kind of review in and of itself. And so what you basically want to do is look at the standards that you want to address, and by asking yourself all of those questions that we reviewed on the previous slide, we're looking for ways that we can differentiate. What changes can we make? And these don't have to be major changes, you guys. These can be very minor in terms of nature. We just want to look at our students and figure out a way to make that particular lesson much more appealing or consistent with their particular needs. And the great thing about differentiation is that these strategies do not just benefit your students with special needs. They're going to benefit all of your students. So these changes are not just for, say, a few, and that's another misperception that many teachers have. They feel as though making these changes are just for the benefit of a couple of students. However, what ends up happening is that by making some minor changes in differentiation, the other students benefit greatly. You'll find that maybe fewer questions are being asked, and that your students that do not have any learning needs are doing even better on the assessments. They are retaining even more information. So these particular skills and strategies will not just help your students with diverse learning needs. They're going to help everybody, and that's definitely something that you will find once you start implementing some of these. Okay. So again, I'll let you kind of peruse these because these are just different examples of situations or tools that you can use to allow students to demonstrate concept mastery. These are just different ideas that you could use in terms of instruction. So say, for example, having guest speakers or using learning centers, creating projects, having options for independent study. Now, with step 6, I really like step 6 because this involves metacognition. Metacognition is knowing that you know. So we really want to encourage kids or give kids time within a lesson to reflect on what they felt they knew, what they felt they understood, and what still remains unclear. Okay, so what maybe is still a little confusing, or what am I still completely lost on in terms of understanding? So that's really important. And a lot of times I think as teachers, we assume that students will just do this naturally and on their own, when this is really a skill that we need to start teaching early on and encouraging throughout the educational process. Okay, this is what's called the brain checklist, which will help in terms of differentiating content. So of course, the first one is to build that safe environment that we talked about. Recognizing and honoring diversity is incredibly important as well, understanding that not all students learn the same way. Also understanding that just because you are differentiating doesn't mean you are watering down content. Again, you're teaching to the students' needs. So that way we want to make sure that students can access the material given their strengths and given their needs. Okay, assessment is another one. So you always want to establish a baseline to determine where students are, and then that will help you and then collect data throughout the instructional process so you can monitor, adjust, figure out who maybe needs additional help and remediation, when you can move on because say students have mastered the content. That's where assessment comes into play. And again, we'll talk about alternative forms of assessment in upcoming modules. There are also instructional strategies are another one. So again, appealing to student interests. A lot of time that involves using real world examples. A lot of times we have students say, why do I need to know this? Or when am I ever going to use this? Try to combat that by addressing that early, the beginning of a lesson. When students feel as though there is a real life component to the lesson, they are going to be much more likely to engage and persist in the learning. Creating numerous curriculum approaches is kind of what we've been talking about throughout this activity already. Okay, so here's just some more information, some more resources that you can access. They were created by Chapman and Gregory, as well as others on differentiated instruction. So I hope all of you enjoyed the lecture. Again, the biggest challenge, I think, to differentiating instruction is just getting one's feet wet and, kind of figuring or kind of getting past that mental block of saying this is going to be too difficult or this is going to take too much time. And again, once you actually force yourself to do it, you will find that it becomes a lot easier in the future, and it will become a natural part of your routine to where soon you will find yourself not even really thinking about it. It'll just be a natural form of teaching and a natural part of your practice. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the module, and feel free to email your instructor if you have any questions.